There exists, in the climate-controlled archives of the Galveston Historical Foundation, a ledger that should not disturb anyone who examines it. The paper is yellowed but preserved, the ink faded to sepia tones that speak of age without drama. The handwriting is steady, practiced, belonging to someone who recorded transactions as routine business. And yet, historians who have studied this particular ledger report a sensation they struggle to articulate. Not fear, precisely, not horror in any conventional sense, something closer to unease that settles in the chest and refuses to leave. The entry in question appears on a page dated December 9, 1859. The notation reads, Lot 47, male, age unknown, estimated 28 to 34 years, origin undocumented, height recorded as 6 feet, physical condition excellent, distinguishing features none externally visible. What follows this description is unusual. 7 lines of cramped text, added in different ink, possibly by a different hand, though the archives cannot confirm this with certainty. The additional notation states, Buyer warned. Previous sale records indicate documented pattern of... And here the writing becomes difficult to decipher, as though whoever wrote it hesitated. Cognitive presentation inconsistent with expected parameters. 3 prior owners relinquished asset voluntarily. No legal cause provided. Sale price adjusted downward to reflect documented complications. The final line of the entry, written in the original hand, records the transaction. Sold, $340. Purchaser, E. Garrett, acting as agent. Final destination, unknown. Documentation attached, per request. What documentation was attached has been lost, or perhaps was never preserved, but the ledger itself remains, and with it, a question that archivists have avoided asking directly for over a century. What could cause 3 separate owners to voluntarily relinquish a healthy male slave in his prime working years? What complications would justify selling such property at nearly half its expected value? And why would the final destination remain unknown when such information was routinely documented for legal and insurance purposes? The story that emerges from fragmentary records, scattered correspondence, and testimony buried in courthouse files is not one of rebellion or escape. It is something far more disturbing. Something that suggests the human capacity for intelligence may occasionally manifest in ways that cannot be comfortably acknowledged, particularly when that intelligence appears in someone the law has defined as property rather than person. Galveston, in 1859, existed as a paradox made solid through cotton and commerce. The city occupied a barrier island on the Texas Gulf Coast, separated from the mainland by a bay that could be crossed by ferry or shallow draft vessel. The Strand, as the commercial waterfront was known, stretched along the northern edge of the island, where wharves extended into water deep enough for ocean-going ships. Warehouses lined the street behind the docks, their brick facades stained by salt spray and decades of humid air. Between these warehouses, auction houses operated with the same regularity as grain merchants or shipping offices. The trade they conducted was documented with identical attention to detail, identical professional detachment, identical concern for legal precision and financial accuracy. Human beings were bought and sold in these buildings 6 days each week, excluding Sundays. The auctioneers who managed these transactions were respected businessmen who attended church, served on civic committees, and maintained detailed records that preserved every aspect of their commerce except the full humanity of those they traded. The system functioned because everyone involved agreed to see slaves as property first and people second, if at all. This inversion of perception was not natural, but learned, reinforced through law and custom and economic necessity until it became reflexive. Most white residents of Galveston in 1859 could observe the intelligence, emotion, and capability of enslaved people daily while simultaneously maintaining the belief that these same people were fundamentally inferior, naturally suited to servitude, incapable of the full range of human thought and feeling. The contradiction was managed through selective attention, through social structures that punished acknowledgement of enslaved humanity, through religious and scientific justifications that provided comfortable explanations for uncomfortable realities. Into this carefully maintained system of collective blindness came something that could not be ignored or explained away. The first documented reference appears in a letter dated March 1857, written by a Virginia planter named Carlyle to a colleague in South Carolina. The letter, preserved because it was used later as evidence in an unrelated property dispute, discusses the recent purchase of a slave at a Richmond auction. Carlyle describes the man as physically unremarkable, with nothing in his appearance or initial behavior to distinguish him from dozens of others sold that same day. "I acquired him for field labor," Carlyle writes, having assessed his build and condition as suitable for tobacco cultivation. The auctioneer provided no history beyond the standard assurances regarding health and temperament. I anticipated no difficulties. What Carlyle encountered instead fundamentally altered his understanding of what was possible. Within 3 weeks of arriving at Carlyle's plantation, the man, whose name was recorded only as Nathaniel, had demonstrated capabilities that defied explanation. He learned the complex seasonal requirements of tobacco cultivation, not through months of training, but through, apparently, a single observation of the work cycle. He could predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, suggesting harvest timing that consistently proved optimal when Carlyle's overseer's conventional wisdom would have led to lesser yields. Most disturbingly, Nathaniel appeared to understand written materials after the briefest exposure. Carlyle discovered this when the man correctly recited the contents of an agricultural journal that had been briefly visible on Carlyle's desk during a momentary visit to the main house. The recitation was not approximate or paraphrased. It was verbatim, including technical terminology and numerical data, reproduced after what could not have been more than seconds of observation. Carlyle's letter does not express wonder or excitement at these abilities. Instead, it conveys something closer to dread. "I find myself unsettled in ways I cannot adequately explain," he writes. "The man demonstrates no defiance, no resistance, no attempt to leverage his unusual capabilities for personal advantage. He simply exists with a quality of awareness that I find increasingly difficult to be near. Yesterday, I caught myself seeking his opinion before making a decision regarding crop rotation, as though he were a consultant rather than my property. This impulse disturbs me more than I can rationally justify." The letter concludes with Carlyle's decision to sell Nathaniel despite his obvious value. "I cannot maintain him here. His presence creates a tension that affects plantation operations in ways I lack vocabulary to describe. The other slaves defer to him without any visible communication, creating an authority structure that bypasses my overseer entirely. More significantly, I find myself unable to look at him without experiencing doubt about the entire system upon which my livelihood depends. If one slave possesses intelligence that exceeds my own in demonstrable ways, what does this indicate about the thousands of others I have observed but never truly examined?" The recipient of Carlyle's letter, a planter named Hammond, responded with advice that reveals the depth of anxiety such cases produced. His reply, preserved in the same archive, suggests that Carlyle should dispose of the asset immediately and discuss the matter with no one. There are truths that undermine necessary fictions, and this situation appears to involve such truth. Better to accept financial loss than risk allowing doubt to spread regarding premises we cannot afford to question. Nathaniel was sold to a cotton broker operating between Virginia and Louisiana. The broker, whose name appears in records as J. Hastings, operated a business that involved purchasing slaves in the Upper South and transporting them for resale in the expanding cotton regions of the Deep South and Texas. Hastings maintained detailed records of his transactions, and among these records is a notation that reveals his awareness of what he had acquired. Purchased from Carlisle, Virginia, 1 male slave, prime age, excellent physical condition, price notably reduced. Carlisle provided verbal warning regarding unusual characteristics, but declined to specify nature of concern. Initial assessment confirms physical value exceeds purchase price substantially. Query: what motivates vendor to accept such loss? The question was answered during the 2-week journey from Virginia to New Orleans. Hastings traveled with his purchases personally, maintaining security and ensuring assets arrived in marketable condition. During this journey, he observed Nathaniel carefully and became convinced that Carlisle's vague warnings concealed something extraordinary. In a journal entry dated May 1857, Hastings describes an incident that occurred while stopped at a Tennessee river town for provisions. We sheltered at an inn overnight. I occupied a private room, reviewing account books and correspondence. Nathaniel was secured in the stable with other purchases. In the morning, he commented, without prompting or any apparent purpose, that my calculations regarding profit margins contained an error in the 3rd column. I had made no mention of these calculations, and the ledger had never left my room. When I examined my figures, his observation proved correct. I had transposed 2 numbers in a series of additions involving several $100s. How he knew of this error remains inexplicable. Hastings' journal entries from the remainder of the journey document increasing discomfort that parallels Carlisle's experience. Nathaniel never displayed defiance or attempted escape. He responded to instructions immediately, maintained appropriate deference in his manner and speech, and gave no outward indication of any agenda beyond compliance with his circumstances. Yet Hastings found himself profoundly disturbed by something he could not precisely identify. The man observes everything with an attention that feels absolute, not furtive or suspicious, but comprehensive, as though he is recording information with a purpose I cannot discern. Yesterday, while we waited for ferry passage across a swollen river, he stood silent for perhaps an hour, watching the current, the loading operations, the movement of other travelers. When we finally crossed, I heard him quietly mention to another slave that the ferryman was overloading and that the vessel would sit dangerously low in the water. This proved accurate. The ferryman was forced to remove cargo to achieve safe clearance. The journal continues. I find myself seeking conversations with him, drawn by the quality of his responses, despite my certainty that such interaction is inappropriate and possibly dangerous. He speaks when addressed with careful formality, but his answers demonstrate understanding that goes far beyond the questions asked. When I mentioned we would reach New Orleans in 3 days, he replied that, weather permitting and assuming no further mechanical issues with the riverboat, we should arrive on Thursday afternoon at approximately 3 o'clock. We arrived Thursday at 3:15. His calculation accounted for variables I had not considered. By the time they reached New Orleans, Hastings had decided that Nathaniel could not be sold through normal channels. The case required special handling, buyers who could be prepared for what they were acquiring, documentation that protected Hastings from later claims of fraud or misrepresentation. He composed a detailed account of Nathaniel's demonstrated abilities, gathered testimony from others who had witnessed these capabilities, and attached these materials to the sale documents that would accompany Nathaniel to his next owner. This documentation created a paper trail that preserved information the system would otherwise have suppressed. The auction houses of New Orleans handled thousands of slaves annually. Most sold with minimal documentation, standard assessments of age and physical condition, sometimes a note regarding specific skills like carpentry or blacksmithing. Nathaniel's papers were different. They included sworn statements from Carlisle describing the tobacco field incident and the agricultural journal recitation. They included excerpts from Hastings' journal detailing the calculation error and the fairy prediction. They included a medical examination by a New Orleans physician who had tested Nathaniel's capabilities systematically and produced a report that concluded, "Subject demonstrates memory and calculation abilities that exceed any I have previously encountered in approximately 40 years of medical practice, working with individuals of all races and social positions. I can offer no physiological explanation for these capabilities. The brain, upon external examination, appears normal in size and proportion. Cognitive function, however, operates at a level that suggests either elaborate deception, which I cannot credit given the consistency of results across multiple tests, or genuine neurological capacity beyond standard human parameters." The physician's report included details of the testing methodology. Nathaniel had been shown a page of dense text for 30 seconds, then asked to reproduce it. He recited the entire page verbatim, including punctuation and footnote numbers. He was given complex mathematical problems, typically requiring written calculation, and solved them mentally within seconds. He was tested in languages he claimed to understand and demonstrated fluency in French, Spanish, and Latin, despite having no documented access to formal education in any of these languages. Most disturbingly, he was asked to describe the contents of a locked cabinet visible across the examination room. He correctly identified 3 books by title and author, after the physician insisted, having no possible means of seeing inside the cabinet or knowing what it contained. The physician concluded his report with an observation that captured the fundamental problem Nathaniel represented. "I cannot determine whether this individual's capabilities constitute an extreme example of normal human potential or something that exists outside currently understood parameters. What is certain is that his enslavement raises questions I lack the moral authority to answer in a professional capacity. If intelligence of this magnitude can manifest in a person legally defined as property, what does this indicate about the thousands of others who remain enslaved? Are we to believe this case is unique? Or that intelligence and capability have been systematically present but deliberately overlooked in order to maintain a system that requires their denial?" These materials accompanied Nathaniel when Hastings arranged his sale to a Texas cotton planter through an intermediary. The sale was negotiated privately rather than through public auction, with the understanding that the buyer was being fully informed of what he was acquiring and accepting responsibility for any complications that might arise from Nathaniel's unusual characteristics. The buyer was a man named Edward Garrett, though records suggest he was acting as purchasing agent for another party whose identity was never officially documented. Garrett operated a modest cotton operation 20 miles inland from Galveston, working land that was productive but not extensive, employing approximately 40 slaves on 800 acres. He was known locally as competent but unexceptional, a man who managed his affairs carefully and avoided the social ambitions that drove many planters to expand beyond sustainable limits. What motivated Garrett to purchase Nathaniel, given the documented complications, remains unclear. Correspondence discovered in a courthouse fire salvage collection suggests that Garrett may have been approached by someone else, possibly someone who could not purchase Nathaniel directly for legal or social reasons, but who wanted access to his capabilities for purposes the records do not specify. One fragment of a letter, partially burned but still legible, references the unusual acquisition we discussed and mentions compensation for maintenance and discretion beyond standard property management fees. This suggests Garrett may have been serving as custodian for someone else's property, a practice that was legal but uncommon and typically employed only when the actual owner had reasons for maintaining anonymity. Nathaniel arrived at Garrett's property in June 1857. For approximately 8 months, life proceeded normally, or as normally as slavery ever proceeded. Nathaniel worked in the fields during planting and cultivation seasons, performed maintenance tasks during slower periods, and gave no indication that he possessed any capabilities beyond what physical labor required. Garrett, if he was indeed holding Nathaniel for another party, seemed content to keep him occupied with routine work while avoiding any situation that might reveal his extraordinary intelligence to other slaves or white workers on the property. The stability of this arrangement was destroyed by an event that appears in records only through its consequences. In February 1858, a fire broke out in one of Garrett's cotton storage barns. The cause was never determined, but the fire itself was not particularly unusual. Such incidents occurred regularly on plantations, where large quantities of flammable material were stored in wooden structures lit by open flames. What was unusual was how the fire was contained. According to a deposition given later by Garrett's overseer, a man named Parrish, Nathaniel appeared at the main house within minutes of the fire starting, though no alarm had yet been raised, and the barn was not visible from the slave quarters where Nathaniel was housed. He informed Parrish that the fire could be controlled if water were applied to the east wall of the adjacent barn, creating a wet barrier that would prevent the flames from spreading. He specified that the west wall should be left alone because the wind direction made that side defenseless, and efforts would be better spent protecting structures further away. Parrish's deposition states, "I followed his directions because there was no time to debate, and his certainty was absolute." His assessment proved correct. The fire consumed the first barn entirely, but spread no further. When I asked him afterward how he had known where to focus our efforts, he stated that he had observed the wind, the construction of the buildings, the location of water sources, and the likely progression of the flames, then calculated the optimal response. His explanation was delivered in the tone one might use to describe routine work rather than complex analysis performed during an emergency. The incident could not be concealed. Too many people had been involved in fighting the fire, had witnessed Nathaniel's intervention, had observed that his directions were followed and proved effective. Word spread among the slave community first, then among white workers, then into the broader network of planters and merchants who conducted business with Garrett. Within weeks, people throughout the region had heard that Garrett owned a slave with unusual capabilities, someone who could analyze complex situations and provide solutions that exceeded what trained overseers could produce. The attention this created was exactly what Garrett had apparently been trying to avoid. He found himself answering questions from neighbors, deflecting requests from other planters who wanted to borrow Nathaniel's services, managing rumors that grew increasingly exaggerated with each retelling. Some stories claimed Nathaniel could predict the future. Others suggested he possessed supernatural knowledge. A few whispered that he was dangerous, that intelligence of his magnitude in an enslaved person represented a threat that could not be safely managed. Garrett's response to this attention was to impose strict isolation on Nathaniel. He was removed from field work and confined to a small cabin near the main house, where he could be observed constantly. He was not allowed to interact with other slaves except under direct supervision. He was given no tasks that would require him to demonstrate his intelligence or provide opportunities for others to witness his capabilities. The goal, apparently, was to make Nathaniel invisible, to suppress awareness of what he represented until attention moved elsewhere. This isolation lasted for approximately 4 months. During this period, Garrett received at least 2 offers to purchase Nathaniel at prices well above standard market value. He refused both offers, suggesting he was still acting as agent for someone else who would not authorize sale. But the situation was clearly untenable. Keeping Nathaniel in isolation was expensive, both in terms of lost labor and in terms of the constant supervision required. More significantly, the isolation itself was attracting exactly the attention Garrett seemed desperate to avoid. People began asking why a healthy slave in his prime working years was being kept confined without apparent purpose. The questions implied suspicion, suggested Nathaniel might be dangerous or diseased, threatened to damage Garrett's reputation and business relationships. In October 1858, Garrett made the decision to sell Nathaniel, despite whatever arrangement he had made with the unknown party who had apparently commissioned the original purchase. Records indicate the sale was conducted through an intermediary in Galveston, that Garrett accepted a price significantly below what he had paid Hastings, and that he required the buyer to sign documentation acknowledging awareness of Nathaniel's unusual characteristics and releasing Garrett from any liability regarding future complications. The buyer was another intermediary, someone whose role was to receive property and transfer it elsewhere, essentially another layer of anonymity between Nathaniel and whoever ultimately controlled his fate. This buyer held Nathaniel for less than 6 weeks before selling him again, this time at an even lower price. The pattern that had begun with Carlisle's sale continued. Each owner recognized Nathaniel's extraordinary value, but found his presence unbearable, and chose to accept financial loss rather than maintain custody of someone whose intelligence made comfortable self-deception impossible. By the time Nathaniel appeared in the Galveston auction ledger in December 1859, he had been sold 5 times in less than 3 years. Each sale reduced his price further below standard market value for a healthy male slave in his prime years. Each sale included more elaborate documentation warning buyers about complications they should expect. Each sale represented another person who had encountered intelligence they could not explain or comfortably acknowledge and had chosen to pass the problem elsewhere rather than confront what it implied. The final buyer, recorded in the December 1859 ledger entry, E. Garrett, acting as agent, was possibly the same Edward Garrett who had owned Nathaniel in 1857 and 1858, or possibly a relative serving a similar function. The notation that final destination was unknown suggests that Nathaniel was purchased to be transported elsewhere, perhaps out of Texas entirely, perhaps to somewhere his presence would be less likely to generate attention and questions. What happened after this final recorded sale cannot be documented with certainty. No subsequent auction records mention anyone matching Nathaniel's description. No plantation records in accessible archives show his arrival as new property. No newspapers from the period mention a slave with extraordinary intelligence, though many such papers included notices about runaways, about slaves for sale, about incidents involving enslaved people who had committed crimes or suffered punishments. Nathaniel simply disappears from the historical record after December 1859, as completely as though he had never existed. 3 possibilities present themselves, none of them comforting. The first is that Nathaniel was transported far from Galveston, perhaps to a remote plantation in deep Texas or Louisiana or Arkansas, somewhere his abilities could be utilized by an owner willing to accept the psychological burden of enslaving someone demonstrably more intelligent than himself. If this occurred, Nathaniel might have lived out his life in isolation, his capabilities exploited without acknowledgement, his existence carefully concealed from others who might be disturbed by what he represented. He would have experienced slavery's daily humiliations and violences while possessing perfect awareness of their injustice, perfect understanding of how arbitrary his circumstances were, perfect memory of every indignity that could never be forgotten or softened by time. The second possibility is darker. There exist hints in fragmentary documents that some slaveholders, when confronted with slaves whose intelligence threatened the system's foundational assumptions, chose permanent solutions. An 1860 letter from a Louisiana planter to his brother mentions in passing the necessity of addressing exceptional cases in ways that preserve stability, even at the cost of valuable property. The phrasing is deliberately vague, but the implication is clear. If Nathaniel's intelligence was deemed too dangerous to manage and too problematic to pass to another owner, someone might have concluded that eliminating the problem entirely was preferable to allowing it to continue generating questions and doubt. The third possibility is the one that has caused the most speculation among the few historians who have examined this case. There exists a single document, discovered in 1973 among papers being processed for donation to a university archive, that may reference Nathaniel's fate. The document is a diary entry from a Galveston physician named Thaddeus Monroe, dated March 1860. Monroe writes, "I was called today to a property near the bay to examine a Negro male who had been injured in an accident involving loading equipment. When I arrived, I found the man deceased. The body showed evidence of severe trauma consistent with the described accident. However, I noted several inconsistencies that troubled me. The positioning of the injuries suggested a fall, yet the equipment involved would not have allowed for such positioning. The witnesses to the accident provided accounts that were oddly uniform, as though rehearsed. Most disturbing, the deceased man's effects included papers that appeared to be mathematical calculations and written observations of extraordinary sophistication, composed in a hand that could only have belonged to him." Monroe continues, "I questioned the property owner about these papers and received an explanation that satisfied legal requirements but not logical scrutiny. The owner claimed the deceased had been employed as a messenger and had carried documents belonging to others, which explained the presence of sophisticated materials among his effects. When I pressed for details regarding these others, I was politely but firmly discouraged from further inquiry. The circumstances suggested this death was not accidental but intentional, perhaps enacted by parties who found the deceased's presence intolerable, for reasons I could only partially infer. I am aware I should report suspicions of foul play to appropriate authorities. I am equally aware that doing so would accomplish nothing beyond damaging my practice and reputation. The deceased was property. The law protects property owners' rights to manage their property as they see fit, even unto death." Monroe's diary entry does not mention Nathaniel by name. It provides no definitive connection between the deceased he examined and the man sold in Galveston 3 months earlier, but the timing aligns. The location is consistent with where someone purchased for unknown purposes might have been taken. Most significantly, the detail about sophisticated written materials found among the dead man's effects suggests someone who possessed exactly the capabilities that made Nathaniel simultaneously invaluable and unbearable to those who owned him. If Monroe's examination involved Nathaniel's body, if the death he suspected was not accidental was in fact deliberate elimination of someone whose intelligence threatened the comfortable fictions slavery required, then the final disposition of the most intelligent male slave ever documented in Galveston was murder, disguised as accident. Erased without trial or consequence because the victim was legally property, and the law provided no mechanism for justice when property destroyed itself. The historical record offers no resolution to these possibilities. Nathaniel remains absent from subsequent documentation, neither living nor conclusively dead, existing only in the fragmentary papers that accumulated during his brief visibility in the system that enslaved him. What these fragments reveal is more disturbing than any single outcome could be. They demonstrate that American slavery encountered, on rare occasions, individuals whose intelligence could not be comfortably denied, even by those most invested in denying enslaved people's full humanity. And they reveal that the system responded to such cases not by questioning its foundational premises, but by suppressing, hiding, or eliminating the evidence that contradicted those premises. The question that remains is not whether Nathaniel was real or whether his abilities were genuinely extraordinary. The documentation from multiple independent sources, written by people who had no reason to collaborate on an elaborate fiction, confirms both his existence and his capabilities. The question is what his case reveals about the thousands of other enslaved people whose intelligence was never documented, never acknowledged, never allowed to develop, because the system required their intellectual capacity to remain invisible. Intelligence exists on a spectrum. Nathaniel's abilities, if the documents can be trusted, placed him at an extreme end of that spectrum, so far beyond normal human capability that even people committed to denying enslaved humanity could not ignore what they were seeing. But he was not unique in possessing intelligence. He was unique only in possessing intelligence so extraordinary it couldn't be suppressed through the usual mechanisms of denial and selective attention. For every Nathaniel whose capabilities forced uncomfortable recognition, there were thousands of others whose intelligence went unacknowledged, deliberately overlooked, systematically prevented from development through laws forbidding education, through social customs that punished any display of intellectual capacity, through economic systems that valued physical labor and actively discouraged owners from recognizing capabilities that might make enslaved people harder to control. The archives preserve occasional glimpses of this suppressed intelligence. A notation in a plantation ledger mentions a slave who demonstrated unexpected facility with written numbers and kept accounts more accurately than the overseer, creating management complications that were resolved by transferring him to field work, where such skills would not be visible. A letter from a plantation mistress to her sister describes a house slave who speaks with vocabulary and grammar superior to many white persons of my acquaintance, which creates discomfort among visitors, and has led my husband to consider selling her, despite her excellent service. A legal document from a property dispute mentions testimony from a slave whose detailed memory of events and dates proved crucial to resolving the case, but whose testimony could not be officially credited because slaves were legally prohibited from testifying against white persons. These fragments suggest that intelligence among enslaved people was not rare, but common, not absent, but forcibly suppressed, not naturally limited, but deliberately prevented from full expression through systematic denial of education, opportunity, and acknowledgement. The system required this suppression because acknowledging enslaved people's intellectual capability threatened every justification offered for slavery's continuation. If enslaved people could demonstrate intelligence equal to or exceeding that of their owners, then claims about natural racial hierarchies collapsed. If they could learn complex skills quickly, manage sophisticated tasks, and solve problems creatively, then arguments about their fitness only for manual labor became obviously false. If they could reason, plan, and understand their circumstances with clarity, then the entire premise that they were suited to permanent subordination could not be maintained. Nathaniel's case forced several owners to confront these contradictions directly. They could not observe his capabilities without recognizing that he possessed intelligence that challenged everything they believed about race and slavery. But rather than following that recognition to its logical conclusion, rather than questioning whether a system that enslaved such a person could be justified, they chose instead to remove themselves from proximity to the uncomfortable truth he represented. They sold him at a loss, accepted financial damage, and found psychological relief in no longer having to witness evidence that contradicted their worldview. This response reveals the depth of investment in slavery's continuation. Economic interest alone cannot explain why multiple owners chose to lose money rather than profit from Nathaniel's abilities. Fear of rebellion cannot fully explain their discomfort, since Nathaniel never displayed defiance or resistance. What drove their decisions was something more fundamental. The recognition that acknowledging his intelligence required acknowledging that slavery's justifications were lies, and that acknowledging those lies as lies would unravel everything their society was built upon. Better to take a financial loss. Better to pass the problem to someone else. Better to ultimately eliminate the evidence entirely, rather than allow it to generate questions that could not be safely answered within the framework of a slaveholding society. The Civil War that began 16 months after Nathaniel's disappearance from the historical record ultimately ended slavery through violence rather than moral persuasion. 4 years of combat resulted in approximately 750,000 deaths and destroyed the legal structure that had defined millions of people as property. But the war did not resolve the fundamental questions Nathaniel's case had raised. When slavery ended, when legal status changed from property to person, when 4 million people emerged from bondage into a freedom that was incomplete and contested and surrounded by hostility, American society still could not comfortably acknowledge what it had denied for so long. The intelligence and capability that had been systematically suppressed during slavery remained largely unacknowledged after emancipation. Educational opportunities for freed people were limited by lack of resources and active resistance from whites who feared that educated black citizens would challenge the racial hierarchies that persisted despite slavery's legal end. Economic opportunities were constrained by discrimination, by violence, by legal structures that preserved subordination through different mechanisms. Political rights were granted and then systematically undermined through terrorism, fraud, and legislation designed to circumvent constitutional protections. The pattern established during slavery continued. Black intelligence and capability existed but was denied acknowledgement, developed but was prevented from full expression, demonstrated but was met with violence rather than recognition. Nathaniel, if he survived to see slavery's end, would have encountered a society only marginally more willing to acknowledge his humanity than the one that had kept him in chains. And yet, the fragments that preserve his story matter precisely because they document what the system tried to deny. They prove that intelligence had nothing to do with race, that the hierarchies constructed to justify slavery lacked any foundation in natural law or human capability, that the supposed inferiority of enslaved people was fiction, maintained through force rather than fact reflected in honest observation. These fragments create questions that resonate beyond their immediate historical context. If one person of Nathaniel's documented intelligence existed within slavery, how many others possessed similar capabilities that went unrecorded? If multiple owners found his presence psychologically unbearable, how many other enslaved people were sold, isolated, or killed because their intelligence threatened the system? If the response to extraordinary capability was suppression and elimination rather than acknowledgement and justice, what does this reveal about how societies respond to evidence that contradicts their foundational myths? The documentation suggests that slavery encountered these cases repeatedly, that the system had informal mechanisms for handling slaves who demonstrated intelligence that could not be comfortably ignored, that there existed a shadow network of sales and transfers and quiet eliminations designed to remove such cases from visibility before they could generate broader questions about slavery's legitimacy. Nathaniel's case is unusual only because the documentation survived, because enough people recorded their encounters with him to create a fragmentary but consistent account, because the papers were preserved rather than destroyed. How many others like him existed, whose stories left no trace? How many extraordinary minds were extinguished by a system that could not tolerate their existence? How many times did slaveholders encounter intelligence they could not deny and choose suppression over acknowledgement? The questions cannot be answered with the certainty historians prefer. The documentation is too fragmentary. Too much was deliberately not recorded or was destroyed. Too many stories disappeared into the silence that slavery imposed on those it defined as property. But the fragments that remain suggest the answers would be disturbing if they could be known. They suggest that American slavery confronted evidence of its own injustice constantly, daily, in every interaction between enslaved people and those who claimed to own them. And they reveal that the system responded to this evidence not through gradual moral awakening, but through increasingly sophisticated mechanisms of denial, suppression, and elimination, that preserved slavery's continuation by preventing acknowledgement of truths that would have made its continuation impossible. Nathaniel's intelligence was extraordinary, but the response to his intelligence was typical. The pattern repeats across the fragmentary documentation. Slaves who demonstrated capability beyond what the system expected were sold away, isolated, or destroyed. The evidence of their abilities was minimized, explained away, or buried in archives where it would not disturb the comfortable narratives slavery required for its perpetuation. What makes Nathaniel's case different is not the suppression he experienced, but the fact that the suppression left enough traces to reconstruct what occurred. The auctioneers who recorded the declining sale prices, the doctors who examined him and documented their findings, the overseers and owners who wrote letters describing their discomfort. All of these people created a record that survived even as Nathaniel himself disappeared. That record stands as testimony to what the system denied. Not just Nathaniel's individual humanity, but the humanity of every person held in slavery. The intelligence that was systematically prevented from development, the capabilities that were forcibly suppressed, the potential that was deliberately destroyed, because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging that slavery was not the natural order of things, but a structure built on lies and maintained through violence. The ledger from December 1859 remains in the archives. Lot 47, sold for $340, final destination unknown. The man recorded there is absent from subsequent history, erased as completely as though he never existed. But the notation remains, and with it, a question that history has never adequately answered. What does it mean that a society could encounter intelligence it could not deny and choose to eliminate the evidence rather than question the system? What does it reveal about the human capacity for self-deception, for maintaining comfortable fictions in the face of contradictory evidence, for choosing economic and social stability over truth and justice? These are not merely historical questions. They persist in how societies respond to evidence that contradicts established hierarchies, in how systems protect themselves against challenges to their legitimacy, in how power maintains itself through selective acknowledgement and strategic suppression of inconvenient truths. Nathaniel's story, fragmentary and incomplete, serves as a reminder that history contains silences as significant as its documented facts. The absence of his voice from the historical record, the gap where his own account of his experience should exist, speaks as loudly as the observations recorded by those who owned him. He endured slavery with perfect awareness of its injustice, perfect understanding of how arbitrary his circumstances were, perfect memory that prevented him from ever finding relief in forgetting. His intelligence gave him no power to change his situation, no ability to free himself through reasoning with those who claimed to own him, no means of escape beyond the same desperate measures available to any enslaved person, regardless of intellectual capability. He was valuable and disposable simultaneously, essential and intolerable, human and property, in a contradiction that could only be resolved through his removal from the system entirely, whether through sale, isolation, or death. The mystery is not what happened to Nathaniel. The mystery is how a society convinced itself that people like him did not exist, that intelligence and capability among enslaved people were exceptions rather than norms, that the system's cruelties were justified by natural hierarchies rather than exposed as arbitrary impositions maintained through force. That mystery persists in the archives, in the fragments that preserve glimpses of suppressed humanity, in the silences that surround every documented case where the system encountered evidence it could not comfortably acknowledge. Nathaniel walks away from the historical record in December 1859, heading toward an unknown destination, carrying with him intelligence that frightened everyone who encountered it. Whether he survived to see slavery's end, whether he died in the accident Monroe's diary describes, whether he was deliberately eliminated by parties who found his existence intolerable, the record does not say. He simply disappears, becomes absence, joins the countless others whose stories were never told, because telling them would have required acknowledging what the system was built to deny. The ledger remains. The man is gone. The question echoes forward across more than a century and a half. What else was lost that we will never recover? What other intelligence was destroyed that might have contributed to human knowledge, created beauty, solved problems, transformed understanding? How many minds were extinguished by a system that feared them more than it valued them? The archives cannot answer. The silence is absolute. And in that silence, the full horror of what slavery destroyed becomes visible, not through dramatic revelation, but through the quiet recognition of everything that should be present and is not, everything that might have been and was prevented, everyone who existed and has been erased from memory as completely as though they never lived at all.